Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Jillian Boehme.
Hi there, how are you today?
Hey, Molly.
How are you doing?
I am doing really well. I'm happy because it's getting warmer out.
Yes, same here. I just went out for a long bike ride. It's so gorgeous out here.
Finally, right?
Oh yeah, we were in a polar vortex and it was not fun.
That's a good word.
Yeah. So can you tell me about your books?
Absolutely. My first book, Stormrise, is about a girl who uses magic to disguise herself as a boy in order to save her kingdom, and she ends up awakening the dragons of old. And my new release, The Stolen Kingdom, is a story about Maralyth, a vintner's daughter, who has no idea that her hidden magical power is proof of a secret bloodline and claim to the throne. And also about Alac, the king's second son, who hates the dark, stolen magic that comes with the throne he actually hopes never to inherit. Maralyth is coerced into a plot to murder the royal family and seize the throne. But when she meets Alac and learns more about the stolen magic, things become a little more complicated.
That sounds incredible. I've not yet read it, but it's on my to-read list. I'm so excited.
Good.
They sound so great. So what you just described there, these characters sound so interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about how you create characters and like if you have any tips for that?
Oh, what a good question. There are different approaches to creating characters. Some authors like to sit down right in the beginning and create character sketches for each one before they start writing. Mm-hmm. For me, it's not quite that way. I am definitely a plotter. I always have everything planned out, or not everything, but I have a good idea of the story before I begin. But my characters tend to happen more organically. So I'll have an idea of who they are, particularly my protagonist. But a lot of my character development happens in the process of writing. So I go in with an idea and then they develop as I see them interact with each other, interact with the world that I've created. And for me, that's just a better approach to creating believable characters. I know that's different for everybody, though.
I feel the same way. I did a NaNoWriMo, and I tried to do it where I was like plotting out, I'm like, okay, here is how every little bit goes, like how they're going to develop. And
yes,
for me, at least, it feels so much more natural, like experimenting with it.
It is more natural, and I think it's more a part of the creative process. And I don't do really well doing creative things outside of the creative process, if that makes sense. So for me, these characters come to life when I'm actually creating. So that's probably why it works well for me that way.
Yeah, I get that. So you said that you're a plotter, but like, do you fully get your plot out and then let the characters adapt to the plot, or do you go in and go, okay, the plot is going to be what happens? I just have a loose idea and the characters are going to go with that.
It's not a loose idea. I would say I have a good skeleton in place. So I know where my plot points are going to be so that I can hit them at the right time. But yeah, the characters develop according to what's happening. So sometimes that surprises me. I might be in the middle of a scene and a character might respond a way that I didn't plan for them to. So that's when it gets really fun, because then you start to ask yourself questions about the direction you're going in for that character's arc. And is it really going to work the way I thought it would, or does it have to change? So there's always a lot to juggle, as you're going along.
Have you ever had a time when you were writing that like a character almost like, well, you're the one writing it, obviously, but like that they almost surprised you? And it was like, oh no, well, I guess I have to take it in this direction now.
I'm not sure that it's ever gone that far for me. Sometimes it'll be maybe in a small way. It's usually with emotional responses. like if something happens and a character has a particular emotional response that I didn't expect them to have, that makes me look more closely at their backstory and why they would react in a way that maybe surprised me a little bit. So it's never been something that's made me sit down and like rewrite an entire character. But yeah, there are definitely those moments of surprise. And I think that's part of what makes writing fun, those
Yeah.
surprising moments.
Yeah, definitely. So, do you prefer creating characters or like the world they inhabit?
I prefer the characters, I think, because I tend to write more character driven stories. And for me, as a reader, also, I'm all about the characters. If I'm invested in them, if I care about what happens to them. And as a writer, I think that's reflected in my commitment to my characters. But also, to be perfectly honest, world building is not my most fun thing to do.
Agreed.
So, yeah, I just kind of gnash my teeth a lot when I'm in the planning stages. So, definitely would rather spend time with my characters, I think.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite thing about either writing or like writing specifically in the fantasy genre?
Well, fantasy has always been my absolute favorite thing to read ever since I was in middle school. So I really cut my writing teeth on fantasy, I think, as a normal outgrowth of my reading fantasy. I love that you can completely escape from the real world in a way that only books can allow you to do. And I love that magic in fantasy stories opens so much possibility. I guess that's just always been a part of me as a reader, as long as I can remember. So probably that's why I love to write fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah, I love fantasy. Do you have any favorite
Ah,
books? Like any favorite fantasy novels?
oh, so many. But I would be remiss not to mention the ones that I cut my teeth on when I was a young reader. I read all of Catherine Kurtz's Dareny books, and this was back in the 70s before YA fantasy was a thing. In fact, young adult as a category was a brand new thing out there. So when I wanted to read fantasy, all that was out there was the fantasy that was on the adult bookshelves in the bookstores and in the library. So I read her books and absolutely loved them. I read the Terry Brooks, Shannara books.
Mhm.
I read Patricia McKillop. She wrote a lot of fantasy books, but my favorite was The Riddle Master of Head. That's a trilogy. And they're all just very classic, epic fantasy books. And it wasn't until later that when there was more to choose from that I started reading different things. But these are the books that I think probably defined me as a writer without my really realizing that that's what happened.
Yeah. So, what do you think of this new wave coming on where there's so much YA out there? And that's at least for like what I've experienced going into like bookstores and everywhere. It's a lot of the market.
It really is. And I think it's fantastic. I think it's great because there's so much good stuff out there for young readers. And that's important to me. It's also great because a lot of the audience who's reading YA, they're not teenagers. And, these protagonists are teens, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old main characters. But there are a lot of people in their 20s and 30s who just love the genre for all kinds of reasons. So it's this wonderful world of books, not just fantasy, but so many genres.
Yeah.
And
And
I think it's exciting.
yeah, I agree. Something that I've seen a lot too is like younger readers, well, like me a couple years ago, was reading a lot of the YA books. And it's a little bit strange for me reading it and then being the age of the characters now and going, they did what?
Yes, well, that's true. They are admittedly a little larger than life. I think that's especially true for fantasy. If you
Mhm.
read contemporary YA, I think most of the time that's a lot more believable as far as the character's emotional age
Yeah.
matching their actual age. But fantasy, you get a little bit more leeway there, especially if you're writing in a world that's fashioned after the Middle Ages or the Renaissance time period on Earth, because, life started younger then. People got married younger, had babies younger, and they died a lot sooner. So if you have a 17-year-old protagonist who's doing things that seem sort of grown-up-ish, you believe it in the world. So not so much if it's a contemporary novel. So
yeah. For your books, even though they both are fantasy in a world you created, did you have to do any research for like the Middle Ages and medieval times on that?
I did. There's always something you have to research, always. And well, for the Stolen Kingdom, I had to do a lot of research on winemaking and grape growing. And that was fun and very interesting. The one thing that was really a big part of that research wasn't so much how the wine was made, but how it was stored and served hundreds of years ago. You couldn't go to a wine store and pick up a bottle of wine. So I had to figure out, what how much wine was in a barrel and how did they serve it and what did they drink it out of, and because I wanted my world to be reflective of that particular time period. So that was fun and interesting. So there's always something that you don't realize you need to know a lot more about before you write it into a story.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And I love as a reader when I encounter things like that in books, and I'm like, oh, I just learned about medieval winemaking.
Yes.
And it's exciting. Yeah.
It's fun. It's a fun way to learn, and you don't really realize you're learning. That makes it more fun.
Yes. So what are some books and authors who've inspired you?
Well, definitely, as I mentioned, Katherine Kurtz was my number one inspiration back then. She created a really complex and rich world that was very much based on the medieval time period in Europe, but with a really cool magic system in place that has obviously really stuck with me all these years. And right now, I am reading the Game of Thrones books finally.
Oh, yeah.
And oh my goodness, they're so much better than the show. I mean, that's the whole reason I'm reading them, is because I got sucked into Game of Thrones, and then you just can't stop thinking about it. So I decided to read the books. And I have to say that George R.R. Martin, it does the same type of high level, really detailed world building that Katherine Kurtz also did. And that's why one of the reasons why I think I'm enjoying reading those books right now so much. It's unbelievable, the level of detail that he goes into. You spoke earlier of what you have to research. I can't even begin to imagine the amount of research that he did for those books. It's really mind-blowing. So I am really drawn to that. And I aspire to that. I can't say I've taken it to that level, but I just think it's wonderful, and it's very inspiring to me as a reader and as a writer.
Yeah. I've noticed something happens sometimes as also a reader and writer, that when I read certain books, that it feels like I'm being elevated as a writer. Have you ever experienced that?
Yes, that's a wonderful experience. And it's much better than the opposite, when you read something and feel like, I can't write. Why am I even trying? There's that. So yeah, those moments when you feel elevated and inspired are necessary and quite welcome, because it can get discouraging sometimes. Writing is hard. There's no other way to say it, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a background in music. How has that influenced your writing?
Well, that's a good question. I listen to music when I write, and the music I listen to, I create very carefully curated song lists for each novel that I write, so that it reflects the world that I've built. So that way, every time I turn the soundtrack on, I am transported immediately to the world, which makes it easier to jump in and start writing. And I think I probably spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about these songs and the music and searching for new music to listen to. It's actually a very big part of my creative process. So I don't know if that's because I am a musician or just because that's one more thing to be obsessive about as a writer. Who knows?
Yeah, and I everyone has different things like especially related to music. Like one of the best tips that I've heard on this show is someone said that she has like a specific song that she would put on for whenever she wanted to write and it trained her brain whenever she heard that song to start writing.
Oh, that's brilliant.
I know. I
That's
still
good.
think about that to this day.
That's really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you know how it is as a writer. Sometimes you know it's time to write and you will find 58 things to procrastinate with. And it makes no sense because you love to write, you know it's what you want to do. But yeah, training yourself to just do it is so important. So
Yes.
I think that's a fantastic tip.
Yeah, definitely. So, have you ever had to kill your darlings during your writing process?
Oh, all the time. And it's not usually during the drafting process. That's when all the darlings take shape, right?
Yeah.
But I have to say I have definitely gotten better at that as the years have gone by. And in my early years as a writer, my husband, bless his heart, he was so involved in reading my early stuff and then kind of asking me hard questions and pointing things out that weren't believable or they were confusing to him. And I used to fight with him. And it was terrible.
No.
I know. And I would say things like, well, you're just not a reader. You don't understand what I'm trying to say here, justifying my not so good writing.
Oh.
And so all that to say, I didn't know what it meant to kill your darlings back then. And my husband probably wanted to kill his darling.
Oh my God.
But
Yeah.
it was rough. He stuck with me. Oh, he really did. But yeah, now it's funny. It actually feels freeing now when I can look at a passage or a paragraph and say, oh, you know what? This has just got to go. And it's not as painful anymore as it used to be. So, yes, definitely a learned skill. I think any writer at the beginning is going to have trouble seeing how important it is to kill things and get rid of them to make the writing better, because we all fall in love with our own words sometimes. And it's just an artistic thing that happens. And when you're willing to get rid of those words that you think are beautiful for the sake of having a stronger novel, then you're definitely going somewhere as a writer.
Yeah, definitely. So according to your website, you took a break from writing for a little bit. What inspired you to pick it back up?
Well, I think it was more of a losing my way than it was actually taking a break. I didn't consciously stop writing. It's just that my life went into another direction. And all of a sudden, all these years went by and I wasn't writing. But what happened was, and this was a long time ago when the internet was newish, there was a website called ThemeStream. And it was really a writer's dream because basically the way it was set up is that you signed up to be an author and you wrote articles on any topic you wished, and you were paid 10 cents per click. And that adds up really fast. And so
Yeah.
I was making, for a little while, I was making some good money, pocket money, writing for this website. But in the end, it folded. They went down to just 2 cents per click, which all of a sudden you weren't making much money. And then the whole thing shut down, and a lot of authors ended up not getting paid. And it was a mess. But for me personally, that's what got me writing again. I got excited about writing these short little pieces and getting paid for them. So after that fell apart, I decided to write an e-zine for stay-at-home moms, which I was in the middle of being back then. I have 5 kids. And so when they were all rugrats and growing up and
Mhm.
making life interesting and fun and chaotic, I decided to put my writing skills into play and reach out to other stay-at-home and work-at-home moms to encourage them and to offer advice and humor. And that ended up turning into a book, which I self published called My Lima Beans Are Allergic to My Spoon. And that's what that's what brought me back to writing. Now, it wasn't fiction though, because I believed that I could never write a novel. So I had to get over that false belief about myself
Mhm.
before I finally got back to the fiction writing, which is actually what I always loved when I was in school.
Yeah. And now we've got 2 novels. So
Yes.
that's amazing.
Yes.
Um, so can you give me a little bit of background on the name of that book?
Um, the
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 lima
lima
beans one.
beans. Oh, absolutely. So, um, one of my daughters was 4 at the time, and she literally said that to me at the supper table. We were
My
having lima
goodness.
beans, and she looked up at me and she said, "Mommy, my lima beans are allergic to my spoon." And I thought, oh, that's brilliant. That's a book title. So I can't even take credit for it. I have to give my daughter credit for it.
That is amazing.
I mean, kids just say the craziest things sometimes. I don't know where she came up with that, but I loved it.
As someone I've worked with a lot of kindergartners and stuff,
Ah,
and they're always like, I can't think of any specific ones right now, but it's just always saying the funniest stuff.
oh, kids are wonderful.
Yeah.
I love kids.
Yeah. So when did you start writing?
My oldest memory of writing was when I was 6. I wrote a poem about spring. And I don't know if that was actually my very first thing that I wrote, but it's the one that I remember writing.
Mhm.
So I would say pretty much from when I could hold a pencil, I was writing.
That is awesome. How did that so you well, I'm getting a little turned around here. So you started writing when you were 6, at least is that's where you remember. But then you sustained that. A lot of people do start when they're younger, but they struggle with sustaining it. Do you have any tips with like
Yeah,
how it
it is hard to
kept up?
sustain. Well, and when you're a kid too, and not just a little kid, but as you grow into your teen years, and if you do have a desire to write, it's very common to start things and not finish them.
Mm.
And that's part of the learning process too, especially if you're trying to write a novel. And I can't tell you how many of those I started when I was in high school. And by start, I mean literally wrote a chapter or less and then just gave it up. And it's actually a lot easier for young writers now because of things like NaNoWriMo, where you can hook up with a whole community of writers and you have accountability and inspiration, and it's a lot easier to plug in and to get it done. So I didn't have that.
Mhm.
So I think that's a wonderful thing nowadays for young writers and all writers who want to do that kind of thing. So I think that it comes down to just like anything else in your life, if you know that you want to get good at something, you have to spend dedicated time on it. And that's going to look different to everybody. For one person, that might look like I'm going to write for 1 hour every morning before my day starts. Or it might look like every Saturday I'm writing for 5 hours. You know, whatever works for you, you just have to be really consistent and you have to be willing to do it when you don't feel like doing it.
Mhm.
Then that's when the growth happens. So, and that happens at a different point for everybody because we're all different. But definitely just being committed to whatever it is you want to master. As a musician, I lived that because that's what my college degree is in. I was a piano major. And for those 4 years, the piano was my life. I would practice anywhere from 4 to 6 hours a day. And it was, it's whatever you put in is what you get out of it. So I tried to use that analogy of piano practice when it comes to writing, because it's the same kind of thing. You don't necessarily need to write for 5 or 6 hours a day to get it done. Music's a little bit different that way. It takes more time for mastery, but writing even just 30 or 45 minutes a day is going to make a huge difference. So I think that's really the key. You've got to make that mental decision that that's what you're going to do, and then commit yourself to it.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really great advice. And I hope everyone listening to this is really listening to what you just said there. Yeah, my grandpa was actually pretty popular out in Chicago jazz musician, and my dad did a lot of that too. And so they always have said to me, like my parents, everyone have always said, like, make sure to practice in areas like that. So when you were just using that metaphor, it was like deja vu almost, because I hear that all the time.
That was nothing new to you then. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been so great to talk to you. I just have one final question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Well, I am currently drafting a new YA fantasy, and that's kind of all I can say about that at this point. But also, for many years, I have run a blog for writers called Miss Snark's First Victim. And ever since my first book came out, I haven't been able to put a lot of time into the blog. I've just been really busy. But I've recently made the commitment to start things up over there again. And even when I don't have new things going on the blog, it's a great place for writers to go and read the archived things.
Yeah.
Pretty much anything that comes up on the topic of writing and querying to get an agent and publishing in general, you can find on the blog there. So I warmly invite any aspiring authors to come and visit the blog.
Awesome. Yeah, I will definitely check that out. I hope everyone else checks out all of your work and your blog. Once again, it has been so great. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. This has been so much fun.
Yeah. All right. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Jillian Boehme.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.